All right, and now we are live. I am sorry, Dr. Gray, for the delay, but it is a pleasure to have everyone, and I apologize for the lack of video, but it is a pleasure to have everyone here this afternoon to learn with Dr. Gray on the topic of poverty, individuals and communities, perspectives from Jewish law and thought. Sources were sent out by email and will be shared later. And I feel like I've kept things for too long. Let's get started.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I know these technical difficulties are what they are. The technology helps us reach so many people and do so many wonderful things. And yet when it doesn't want to cooperate, it can make our lives difficult. And speaking of making our lives difficult, that is, broadly speaking, going to be our topic over the next 3 weeks, poverty in its various aspects. We're going to look at a lot of source material. People who have already seen the sources for today will see this. There's a great deal of material. And I have sort of several overarching questions. I'm going to throw them out now. Just keep them in mind. I'll probably repeat them next week and the week after. And the weeks, by the way, are standalone. It's obviously wonderful if the same cohort is together week after week, but each week does stand alone. The questions really are, what are we seeing? What is it that our sages, our great scholars want us to see? What are they bringing to our attention? And of course, who are we seeing? So what and who are we seeing? And how does poverty impact the personhood of the personhood of the impoverished person, the community-ness, if I could coin this awkward term, the community-ness of the Jewish community. And then if I can coin, perhaps an equally or even more awkward term, the people-ness of the Jewish people. How does the fact that there are socioeconomic differences in Jewish communities, how does that impact the people-ness of the Jewish people? I'm going to share my screen now with the source materials, just so we're all sort of literally and figuratively on the same page. And we'll begin right at the beginning with a little section here that I call Poverty Follows the Poor. And what I would suggest, just in terms of our going forward together, some of the sources go together, maybe 2 or 3 sources sometimes are either labeled as going together, or I'll present them together. And once we get the sources out on the virtual table, as it were, I will invite, if people have comments or questions, and I do recommend, it's a classroom practice, and I think it works well to use the Zoom raise hand function. That's way I'm sure to see who you are, and I'm sure to get people in the order in which they have expressed a desire to speak. So to begin with Poverty Follows the Poor, we begin with that great rabbinic sage, Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett was a writer of science fiction and fantasy literature. He passed away, I believe, in 2015, wrote a number of books, just good, fun, escapist fantasy fiction. And this passage really caught my attention. I was into Terry Pratchett at one time from his 1993 novel, Men at Arms. Take Boots, for example. Here we are now hearing about the musings of a character named Captain Samuel Vimes. Take Boots, for example. He earned $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50, but an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two and then leaked when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kinds of boots Vimes always bought and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Ankh-Morpork on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that still would be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time. Well, a poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. This was Captain Samuel Vimes' Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness. Now, who would have thought but Captain Samuel Vimes and Terry Pratchett were Yodei Sefer. They knew their literature. They knew their Gemara, because we read in Bava Kama, Daf Tzadi Bet, Amud Aleph to Bet, 92a to b, there's a conversation between the Amoraim Rava and Rabba Bar Mari, the fourth generation in Bavel, in Babylonia, about where do we get this notion that Batar Anya Azla Aniyuta, the Aramaic phrase is Batar Anya Azla Aniyuta, after the poor, Batar Anya, Azla Aniyuta, poverty follows. Wherever the poor goes, poverty follows. The poor are sort of in this endless loop of poverty from which they can't escape. And Rabba Bar Mari says, well, we derive this principle from a Mishnah. From Tractate Bikurim, rich people would bring their first fruits, their Bikurim, to the temple in gold and silver baskets. Poor people, who also had an obligation to bring Bikurim, the first fruits, they would bring them, not in gold and silver, of course, they would bring them in wicker baskets made of peeled willow, arava klufa, and the poor would give the baskets along with the first fruits to the priests. The rich would get the baskets back. Those were gold and silver baskets. They'd get them back. The poor wouldn't. The poor would give their first fruits in the plant-based baskets, and that would all go to the priests. So to Rabba Bar Mari, this is where the idea of Batar Anya Azla Aniyuta comes from. The poor are already poor. They already are sufficiently impoverished that they sort of have to make their own baskets here to give the first fruits, and they lose the baskets. They're going to constantly be losing the baskets. Now, because it's right here in our sugya, we should note what Rava's proof is. Rava says, no, that's not where this idea of poverty following the poor comes from. Where it comes from is actually Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45, which is about the Mitzorah, the leper. And the entire verse reads, as for the person with a leprous affection, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, he shall cover over his upper lip, and the money language here, he shall cry, unclean, unclean. The tameh, tameh yikra, which is itself an arresting idea. The fact that the poor, says Rava, is analogous to the leper. The Torah says the leper has to call out so that people know to make way. Tameh, tameh, there is someone who is unclean, unclean approaching. And this is, I find, sort of a stunning, arresting image, an analogy that the poor person, it's as if the poor person carries this atmosphere with them. Unclean, unclean, move away, move away. Poverty is sort of this aura that surrounds this person wherever they are. Rava's idea takes us a bit more into this issue of what I've called poverty as social invisibility and even death. Social invisibility, the person is there even though, is not there, excuse me, even though they're there, and the analogy between poverty and death. And here we go to Leviticus Rabbah, in Parashah Lamed-Daled, Parashah 34, Parashah Lamed-Daled of Leviticus Rabbah, for those who are interested, is really a sort of literary ground zero for a great deal of fascinating material about tzedakah, charity, as well as wealth and poverty. I mean, it really is simply full of fascinating material. And here we also get a text, and as I say, it's apropos particularly of Rava, where you see this decline, you see this text arranged in a way that takes us step by step from someone who is poor, who lacks material means, but all the way down to what kind of social invisibility this poverty causes. Shiva Shemot Nikra'u Lo, 7 designations are given to the poor person. And here these designations come from the Tanakh. The Midrash sets them out. Ani, Evyon, Miskain, Rash, Dal, Dach, and Mach. And they are arranged, as I've indicated, in a descending order. Ani, Kamashma'o, says the Midrash. Literally, it means the poor. Okay. Evyon, what is Evyon? Evyon is a degree more impoverished, a degree below the Ani. Shehu mitavel kol. He longs for everything. He senses that lack. There's already the intimation of an emotional, a psychological lack on top of the physical lack. Miskein, the third, miskein shehu bazui lifnei hakol. The miskein is called the miskein because he's despised by everyone. And here we get a verse, Ecclesiastes 9:16, v'chochmat hamiskein bezuyah. The wisdom of the poor person is despised. Nobody cares what the poor person thinks. The poor person may have an idea. It may even be chokhmah. It may even be wisdom, but nobody cares because the person is poor. There is a certain type of invisibility, social invisibility that comes with this. Rash, because he is dispossessed, mitroshesh, of property, dal, because he is detached, midul dal, from property. And then we get to the last two, dach and mach, which I find particularly sad and poignant. Dach, because the person is crushed. The person is miduch dach. And what does that mean? Roed davar, I bolded it in the text in Hebrew and English. Roed davar ve'eno ochel. The person is so lacking in energy, so lacking in spirit, that the person sees something to eat, sees something desirable to eat, ve'eno ochel, roed davar ve'eno shoteh. And wants to see something worth drinking, but cannot drink. The person is lacking in energy. And then mach, the seventh level, shehu mach lakol. The person becomes ka'askofa hatachtona, almost like the threshold. In other words, people walk over this person, they don't even see this person. There is a radical social invisibility here. So Leviticus Rabbah, again, in keeping with sort of my broader opening question, who are we seeing? What are we seeing? We're seeing these 7 levels of poverty in a descending level, going from lack or insecurity in material possessions through stages of social invisibility to the point where, as the rabbis say, dach and mach, you get people who, as it were, can barely move and are ignored by other people. Now we ask ourselves, or we tell ourselves sometimes, where were we when certain things happened? Where were we when this news event happened or this historical event happened? This next text is one that I always say, I remember where I was when I first encountered this particular text from Genesis Rabbah, and there's a reason that I've juxtaposed it directly to what we just looked at, because I was so stunned by the visual image in the text. And it also tells us something about who and what are we looking at and the damage done to human dignity by extreme poverty. This comes from Genesis Rabbah, the great midrash to the book of Genesis. And we're told that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, when he visited Rome, what did he see? Well, it's Rome. He saw big pillars. He saw pillars covered with tapestries, tafitin. In winter, the tapestries were there so that they would protect the pillars, so that presumably they wouldn't contract, that water wouldn't get in there and damage shouldn't occur. And in the summer, they're covered with tapestries so that they shouldn't break apart. Great concern with making sure that the pillars all stay intact. And then what did Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi do? Umahalech b'shuka, he went walking in the marketplace. Chamachad miskein mechrach b'chada machatzala. He saw a poor person. Notice the word miskein that we saw previously in Leviticus Rabbah. He saw a poor person wrapped up in a mat. And then others say it was palgu mirda'a de chamar. It wasn't a mat. It was half of an ass's pack saddle. And he was struck by this, and he says something that we'll get to in a moment. But what struck me was the visual imagery, the contrast between the vertical pillars, the marble pillars, the inanimate objects that make the appearance of the city of Rome great. The marble pillars are upright, and the people of Rome are taking great care to make sure they're covered with mats. Nothing should happen to these pillars. They shouldn't contract, they shouldn't crack. And then you have the human being, the image of God, lying horizontally. Nobody is making sure that this human being can stand up straight. This human being is lying horizontally, is wrapped in a mat. What do people do with mats? They sit on mats, they walk on mats, or according to others, he's wrapped in half of a donkey's pack saddle. What do people do with donkeys' pack saddles? By definition, they put them on donkeys with packs. It's something which is appropriate for an animal, not appropriate for a human being. So I myself just was astounded by the visual contrast of the vertical pillars and the horizontal human being. And then Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi uses Psalms 36:7 to try to explain this to himself. On the pillars, he read, "Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains." The interpretation added in by the editor, where you give in great abundance. So boy, God, when you want to give somebody something and elevate them and exalt them, you do a magnificent job of it. Then to the poor person, he applied another part of the same verse. Your judgments are like the great deep. Mishpatecha tahom rabbah. Boy, God, when you want to smite somebody, you really smite somebody. You are not wrong if you're picking up in this a sense that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is perhaps tipping his hand as to his vision of what may cause poverty, that in this particular case, he may be ascribing some blame to the person. I would say you're not wrong to see that, but you would be wrong to assume that that is, quote unquote, the rabbinic point of view. In fact, there are a number of rabbinic points of view. There is no one uniform monolithic rabbinic point of view on the causes of poverty. But this sense of the social invisibility, the fact that the inanimate objects get treated much better than the human being created in the image of God, who lies there like a mat, like a saddle, where the inanimate objects, the pillars that hold up the city of Rome, are treated with such care, is truly an arresting image that the rabbis want us to bring to our attention. Let me just throw two other things in the hopper, and then I'll open it up for questions. These two other ideas here that are related, we're taking a step down now from social invisibility to death. Both of these sources come from Masechet Nidarim. The first from the end, Nidarim 64b, Arba'a chashuvin kamet. 4 people are thought of as dead, meaning, of course, even though they are alive. The ani, the mitzorah, the leper, the summa, the unsighted person, and mi she'ein lo banim, and the person who is childless. Again, a form of social death. And then those who do Daf Yomi, the daily Talmud page, will recognize the next one, Nidarim 7b, which we just went by, where again we are told that poverty, aniyut, is kamita. Poverty is like death. Poverty is so harsh, adding in the editorial comments here in the Koren Steinsaltz translation, that it is considered like death, death and poverty going together. Let me just pause here. If anybody would like to use the raise hand function. Okay, let's just throw something else here in the hopper from Brachot 28a, which I also find very touching in terms of the portrayal here of the relationship between two colleagues whose relationship, which we know from other sources in the Talmud, had fallen on hard times. Rabban Gamliel in Masechet Brachot, on page 28, it's a famous story, which many people know, but for those that don't, he behaved rather imperiously toward Rabbi Yehoshua. He is temporarily deposed from power. Rabban Gamliel, to make a long story short, realizes that perhaps he should make amends. And he goes to Rabbi Yehoshua's home in order to make amends. So when he reached Rabbi Yehoshua's house, Kimata levete, chazinahu la'ashita devete demashachran. He noticed that Rabbi Yehoshua, the walls of Rabbi Yehoshua's house were black. And he says to Rabbi Yehoshua, and maybe he's making conversation, but it's very telling, as Rabbi Yehoshua says to him, he says, Mikotle beitcha ata nekar, from the walls of your house, you may be recognized, shapachami ata, that you are a blacksmith. So you're a blacksmith, you're working in your home, the walls of the house are black. And Rabbi Yehoshua says to him, and I can only imagine Rabbi Yehoshua thinking, we worked together for all these years and you never noticed this about me until now. You never paid attention about this until now. He says, Oy lo lador sha'ata farneso, woe to the generation whose leader you are, because you have no idea what people go through. That was obviously an extreme paraphrase on my part. You have no idea what your colleagues go through. You have no idea the difficulties of Torah sages, what they have to do to support themselves and how it is that they have to feed themselves. And you just have absolutely no idea. The next source takes us a bit into the post-Talmudic period, sort of a more early medieval period. The Midrash Tanhuma is dated, even though like all sources that contain rabbinic traditions, it probably contains traditions that do go back to the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries of the Talmudic period. But as a gelled work, it is later, it is post-Talmudic. And this text already takes us in a different direction. And one sees what I would call sort of a greater amount of a sort of violence here to the experience of poverty. And here it's talking about the taking of interest. Umi shehu notel rebit ma kativ bo. What is written, or the one who takes interest, what is written about him? Here the operative verse is Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 13. He that is given forth upon interest and has taken increase. What does that even mean? That is some old-fashioned translation. Shall he then live? He shall not live. And then the parable that we get, really just notice the violence that is involved in this. A king makes his treasures available to a certain individual. In all of rabbinic sources, whenever you have a parable and there's a king, the king, of course, is God. The king makes his treasures available to a certain individual. What does the individual do? Moneh, I lost my place. Moneh bo et ha'aniyim, oppresses the poor. Horeg bo almanot, kills widows. Mivazeh et ha'evyonim, embarrasses, or I would actually use a stronger word, it's not my translation, degrades the needy. Mafshit bo arumim, despoils the naked, strips the clothing off the naked. Osebo Hamas v'gezel, does violence and theft. I mean, there you have the word Hamas, violence, right there, and indulges in falsehood, squandering the king's treasures. And then we get the nimshal, the message right away. Similarly, the Holy Blessed One opens his treasures to the wealthy. Everything ultimately is God's. Li hakesef v'li hazahav, God says in the book of the prophet Haggai. Mine is the silver, mine is the gold. And then what happens? The rich person wants to lend money on interest. And keep in mind, batar ania azla aniyuta, poverty following the poor, is key to this, because what does interest do? Interest locks you in. Interest becomes a web that surrounds you. It's very difficult to get out of interest. We've seen this discussion in the news recently as if it wasn't known before, but we've seen discussion of this with reference to loans in the news. It becomes something that is difficult to escape. And back to the text, the rich person starts to taunt the widows, oppress them with interest, embarrass the poor, humiliate the naked who seek charity. And then if a man's neighbor is in debt to him for 100 zuzim, what does the Baal HaMidrash, what does the Midrash see? What is it that he wants us to see? He beats him, he strips him, he does violence to him, he destroys the pledges. And then, of course, God is upset about this. The passage of Midrash ends with God speaking through a number of passages. But again, the thing to see is that conjunction of social invisibility. In this case, Midrash Tanhuma adds in the layering of violence, social invisibility, violence, vulnerability to death, social death, all of this tied together in the rabbinic conception. This is what the sages wish us to see. These are the people that they want us to see. And again, we have to keep in mind, what does this do to the personhood of these people, to the community-ness of the Jewish community and the people-ness of the Jewish people? One source that over the years I probably have spent way too much time on, but it's a fascinating source. I've spent many hours on the translation and analysis of this source, is this following source from Masechet Bava Batra, Bava Batra 10a. This source is found as part of a lengthy sequence of material about tzedakah in Masechet Bava Batra, which is actually the Talmud Bavli's longest continuous sequence of material, ranging from 7a to 11a in Bava Batra. It's a fascinating source. It allegedly deals with Rabbi Akiva, the famous Tana, the famous sage of the Mishnah, but this source is not early. This source is late for reasons we don't need to go into now. It wants to talk about Rabbi Akiva, but this source is in no way a Tannaitic source. It begins with an introduction in paragraph 1, but if we jump down to paragraph 2, what we see in a nutshell is a back and forth, a debate between Rabbi Akiva and a Roman named Turnus Rufus or Tineius Rufus. And we do see encounters between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, whose name may be represented a little differently here and there in other places as well. But what does he do? He asks Rabbi Akiva, starting hop between the Hebrew and the English, he says to Rabbi Akiva, Im Elohechem ohev aniim hu, if your God loves the poor, if your God really is a lover of the poor, mipnei ma eino mefarnesam. Why doesn't God support them? God loves the poor so much. Why doesn't God support them? Amarle, so Rabbi Akiva answers him, Kedei shenitzol anu bahen medina shel gehinom. Basically, God doesn't support the poor because God is doing us a favor, the non-poor, in order that we might be saved through the poor from the judgment of Gehinom. In other words, we give tzedakah to the poor, and that redounds, that helps us. It saves us from the judgment of Gehinom. This is a doctrine which is known in both Christian writings, scholarly writing, as well as in Jewish scholarly writing, is redemptive almsgiving. The notion that giving charity results in the forgiveness of your sins, it results in your accumulation of treasure in heaven. It does something good for the giver. Those of you who are around in 2 weeks on November 17th, when we talk about strategies to mitigate socioeconomic differences in Jewish communities, I'll say a bit more about redemptive almsgiving as a theological strategy. But this is Rabbi Akiva's answer. So God is doing us a favor. Not the poor get the tzedakah, but we get the being saved from Gehinom. Amarle, so Turnus Rufus, like other Roman individuals in rabbinic literature, is portrayed as somewhat of a scholar. He says, Adarabah, to the contrary, Zosha Mechayavtan leGehinom, supporting the poor should condemn you to Gehinom. Why? What does this resemble? It resembles a situation, he says, of a king of flesh and blood, Sheka'as alavdo, who became angry at his slave, locked him up in prison, and told everybody, don't give him anything to eat or drink. The person who disobeys the king's command and gives this person what to eat or drink, isn't the king going to be angry at him? And you Jews are called God's slaves. Shene'emar ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. Leviticus 25:55. You are God's slaves. what's fascinating here is the introduction of the metaphor of prison. I mean, there are a number of things that are fascinating in every line of this sugya, as well as the entire thing, but the metaphor of prison, that poverty is a prison. It's as if, as it were, God has tossed the person into prison, thrown away the proverbial key. Nobody should feed this person. And Turnus Rufus's point is, if God wanted to do this, how dare you do something to flout the will of God? At this point, Rabbi Akiva changes the metaphor a little bit. It's no longer the king and the slave. It's the king and the prince, the father and the son. The father, the king, is angry at the son, imprisons him in prison, gives the same order, don't give him anything to eat or drink. A person flouts his order. And Rabbi Akiva says, when the king finds out, at the end of the day, the king is a parent. Won't he be happy about it? And we are God's children, as it says in Deuteronomy. Basically, what happens, they reach a kind of a stalemate. Rabbi Akiva closes on a note which should be familiar to us here in paragraph 7 from Isaiah 58:7, which should be familiar to us from the Haftarah on Yom Kippur morning. It is to share your bread with the hungry. But what's interesting is, even in his changing somewhat of the parable, the mashal, Rabbi Akiva still works with that idea of poverty as imprisonment. Poverty is something from which one cannot escape. The machloket, the dispute between Turnus Rufus and Rabbi Akiva, to some extent revolves around the issue of how will God view the person who wishes to help the poor. To Turnus Rufus, we're sinners in the hands of an angry God, to coin a phrase. This is what God wants. God will be angry if you attempt to ameliorate the situation. To Rabbi Akiva, God will, as it were, be grateful if one attempts to ameliorate the situation. But both agree, at least at that pivotal middle part of the sugya, that poverty is a prison. So we have social invisibility, we have death, we have violence, we have poverty as a prison. All of these things our sages want us to see. And then I think very touchingly, they also want us to see something else. They want us to see the physical symptoms of poverty. Source 9 is a source coming from the story in the Torah of Sodom and Amorah. One version, the Talmud Bavli has another version. This is the version from Genesis Rabbah, about the merciful girl who is cruelly tortured and murdered by the people of Sodom, which is said to have sort of convinced God that there was nothing for God to do but to destroy Sodom. Here we're interested not so much in the larger issue there of justice for Sodom, but how the girl and her friend are described. Rabbi Levi talks about two damsels. Oh gosh, I hate that word. Let that be a lesson to you. Do your own translations, but life gets in the way. Okay, shtei na'arot, two young girls go down to draw water from a well. Amra achat lechaverta, one says to her companion, Lama fanaya cholaniot. Why do you look so sick? Why don't you look well? What's the matter? And then the girl answers her, Amrala kalu mazonotenu. Our food has run out. Ukavar anu lamut. We are about ready to die. Now, there's plenty we could discuss here about the social situation in Sodom. That did these girls know each other previously? How had the other girl, the healthy girl, not noticed this before? But whatever, we also can't add too many words to the source the way it is. But notice the lama fanaya cholaniot. Why is your face sick? She's suffering. She's dying of malnutrition. And then, of course, the end of the story is the healthy girl has pity on her, gives her some flour. The people of Sodom find out about this. They're enraged, and they burn the charitable girl. And of course, according to Rabbi Levi, this is what leads God to decide to destroy Sodom. A similar idea about the physical effects of poverty is also found very touchingly in Mishnah Nidarim 9:10. Nidarim seems to be, I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, tractate Nidarim, the basic topic of which is vows. That's the meaning of the word Nidarim, seems to contain a lot of interesting material relevant to our topic. I'll continue to think about that at some point offline. Here we're dealing in this particular Mishnah with a form of a particular vow, and whether the vow is considered to be a neder ta'ut, a vow made in error or not. In this particular case, I'm less interested, of course, in the issue of vows, but what happens is we get a story in the Mishnah, Uma'aseh echad. It turned out once upon a time, it happened with one person, Shenadar mibat achoto hanaya. He, what did he do? He vowed not to derive any benefit from his sister's daughter. In other words, I don't want anything to do with her. Any possible marriage between us will not happen. The issue of uncle-niece marriage is just something I'll name because it's in the text, but we're not going to go into it. But he says, I don't want to marry this girl. V'hichnisuha leveit Rabbi Yishmael v'yipuha. They brought this woman into the house of Rabbi Yishmael, and they literally, they prettied her up. Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael, and then he sees her again, and Rabbi Yishmael says, Beni lazo nadarta, is this the one about whom you took the vow? Amar lo lav, he said, no. V'hitiro Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael released his vow. Now, what happens, what's going on here? We see more clearly what's going on by Rabbi Yishmael's reflection after the fact on the whole event. Bacha Rabbi Yishmael va'amar. Rabbi Yishmael wept and he said, Banot Yisrael na'otain. The daughters of Israel are beautiful. Ella shaha'aniyut minavlatan. But poverty disfigures them. What was the matter with this woman? What was the matter with this woman was the distresses of poverty, the strains, the violence of poverty was visible all over her. She was, quote unquote, unattractive and seen as unattractive for marriage by this man because of her appearance, and her appearance was due to poverty. And it leads Rabbi Yishmael not only to take the legal action he takes, but then to burst into tears. The daughters of Israel are beautiful, poverty disfigures them. And then we get at the end of the Mishnah, the daughters of Israel sort of recognize that Rabbi Yishmael is an ally to them on some level. Ukishamet Rabbi Yishmael, when Rabbi Yishmael died, Hayu Benot Yisrael nos ot kina. The daughters of Israel lamented for him, V'omrot, etc. And we could see here in the English, daughters of Israel weep for Rabbi Yishmael, similar, of course, to what we see in the book of Samuel. Daughters of Israel weep over King Saul in the Bible. So interestingly, these two sources that we've looked at so far have dealt with the physical impact of poverty physically on women. Genesis Rabbah with the unfortunate girl in Sodom, and here in Mishnah Nidarim, this unnamed woman who was seen as unfit for marriage and in fact was separated by vow, by a neder isur, by a vow of prohibition from getting married. It is not necessarily only a feature that is discussed or that is mentioned with relation to women. Here in Brachot 6b, toward the beginning of Masechet Brachot, where there's a lot of agadic or non-legal material that appears here and there, we get a discussion of Psalms 12:9. The verse is, we get the question to Rav Bibi Bar Abaye, or Rav Bibi Bar Abaye asking the question of someone else. What does that verse mean? Kurum zulut livnei adam. It actually is in the Hebrew a strange formulation. Kurum could be like when something is exalted. Zulut Zila, the translation here is vileness. So what does that mean? Kurum zulut livnei adam, when bnei adam, when human beings exalt vileness. What does that mean? And then at first, the answer seems to be straightforward. What does that mean when vileness is exalted among human beings? Well, it means things that really are very important, things that are birumo shel olam, things that really are very important, but which people mizalzalim bahen, but which people in fact don't treat as being very important. But then we get a very interesting, different sort of interpretation. And this other interpretation is sort of comes out of nowhere. It sort of comes out of the blue. We get Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar de Amre Tarvaiho. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both say, Kevan, and here I bolded it in the original and in the English, Kevan shenitztarech adam lebriot, when a person needs other people. Briot, created beings, is one way that the rabbis refer to other human beings. When a person has need of other human beings, which is a certain way of referring to the need for tzedakah, panav mishtanot kekrum, his face changes like the krum. So at first we get an interpretation of the verse that seems to flow more or less naturally from the words. Now we get this other interpretation. So the person needs other people, his face changes like the krum. And then, well, what is this? What are we talking about? Ki ata Ravdimi, when Ravdimi came, meaning Ravdimi came from the land of Israel into Bavel, he brought with him an interpretation of what the word krum in the verse means. He says, Of echad yesh bekarchei hayam, there happens to be a bird in the towns, the walled towns along the coast, presumably the coast of Eretz Yisrael, ukrum shemo, and the name of this bird is a krum, v'kevan shehachama zorachat, and when the sun shines on this bird, mitafech lakama gavanim, it changes color. Okay, Rav Dimi, maybe Rav Dimi is a bird expert among other of his attributes from the land of Israel. But what's interesting again is this almost by the way indication of a physical effect of poverty. A person needs other people. Think about what that means. Think about the fact that this is connected to a verse, Psalms 12:9, which uses the word zulut, which is related to zilzul, a sort of degradation, neglect. A person needs other people, their face will change color. Their face will change. There will be some physical manifestation of this sort of humiliation, this sort of embarrassment. And then apropos of the physical changes of poverty, this comes up toward the end of Ketubot, Bavli Ketubot 110b. Shinui Veset, says Shmuel, the Amora Shmuel says Shinui Veset, Techilat Chole Me'ayim. A change in one's habits is the beginning of trouble with the intestines. One is going to have stomach problems, gastrointestinal problems, when one makes a change in one's habits. Katuv b'Sefer Ben Sira, it is written in the book of Ben Sira. The fact that the Gemara is quoting the book of Ben Sira is another interesting thing I just want to name that we're not going to talk about. The book of Ben Sira here allegedly says, V'chol yemei ani ra'im, all the days, kol yemei ani ra'im, all the days of the poor are bad, are terrible. There's no day. In other words, there are 365 days in the solar year, fewer days in the lunar year. All of those days are terrible for the poor. The Gemara says, well, wait a minute. V'ha'ika Shabbatot v'yamim tovim. Aren't there Sabbaths and holy days? I mean, how could things be terrible on Shabbat? How could things be terrible for the poor on Yom Tov? And now we're assuming the counterintuitive assumption here is it's going to be terrible for the poor, not because they still have nothing on Shabbat and Yom Tov, but it's going to be terrible for the poor even if they have what to make a great Shabbat out of or a great Yom Tov. Kiddush Shmuel. The answer is in accordance with Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel shinui veset tchilat cholei me'ayim. As Shmuel said, a change in one's eating habits is the start of intestinal disease. In other words, the poor person who doesn't have enough to eat, or who doesn't have good food, or who doesn't have healthful, proper food, giving them good food once in a while is not going to do good for them. In fact, if anything, because it's such a change, their bodies are so malnourished, their situation, their health is so precarious that being given the good, healthful food or food in an appropriate quantity, they may be accustomed to eating in an insufficient quantity. Being given the food in an appropriate quantity may in fact hurt them. Hence, Ben Sira said, Kol Yemei Ani Ra'im, all the days of the poor are evil. Again, not excluding any particular day. From physical manifestations, we move on to what I've termed here, spiritual and emotional devastation. And here, as I mentioned before, when I talked about the story of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi visiting Rome from Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, I said it's one of those things. I remember where I was when I first encountered it and thought about it. I could say the same thing about this next sugya from Eruvin 41b. The sugya here, we begin with the Mishnah. We're not going to read through the whole Mishnah, but there is some aspects of the context of the Mishnah that are important to understanding where the Gemara is going, the figurative psychological direction the Gemara is going. Now, the Mishnah says, Mi shahotziyuhu nochrim o ruach ra'ah, a person who was removed either by non-Jews or by an evil spirit, meaning beyond the Sabbath limit, beyond the 2,000 amot area that a person is permitted to occupy on Shabbat. If Gentiles kidnap the person or an evil spirit took hold of the person, and on Shabbat the person ends up beyond that 2,000 amot limit, ein lo ella arba amot. Whoops. The person, when they land in the place in which they've been left, they can only move in a very truncated distance of 4 amot. They basically only have personal space. They have to wait till after Shabbat and then hope somebody comes by to order them a lift, but they can't, they are limited to this personal space. Hechziruhu ke'ilu lo yatsa. If the non-Jews or the Ruach Ra'ah, the evil spirit, bring them back to where they were, then it's as if they never left. And then it goes on to talk about bringing to another city, etc. So in other words, okay, I get it. The Mishnah, what's the Mishnah talking about? The Mishnah is talking about a person who in some way involuntarily ends up being taken outside the permissible 2,000 amot realm for Sabbath, walking for Sabbath, spitziering, and what happens there. Then what we get in the Gemara, part of the Gemara is very interesting, and I've pulled some of it out. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, Shlosha devarim ma'avirin et ha'adam al da'ato. 3 things. I'll first read the translation and then sort of re-render it more in keeping with the literal words used. 3 things deprive a person of his senses, al da'ato v'al da'at kono, and of a knowledge of his creator. And what are these things? Ovdei kochavim, idolaters, ruach ra'ah, an evil spirit, v'dikduke aniyut, an oppressive poverty. Let me go back, be a little more literal, and then say something else about it. Shlosha devarim ma'avirin et ha'adam al da'ato v'al da'at kono. 3 things cause a person to be passed over, to be taken over to the other side of where his mind is and where the knowledge of God is. 3 things cause a person, you're here in your mind, you're being taken over and taken away and cast all the way to the other side. What the Gemara here is doing in this Baraita, in this particular source, is it's turning the Mishnahs, somebody was removed from the Sabbath boundary. It's taking that literal concrete ruling and making it metaphorical. Instead of being physically removed, the person is being psychologically and spiritually removed. There are three things that get you out of your mind, put you out of your mind, and put you at a great distance or removed from your mind. One of those things is dikduke aniyut. It's translated oppressive poverty. Dikduke aniyut, like dikduk, grammar. Why does the word dikduk in modern Hebrew mean grammar? Because it's very detailed, it's very specific. Dikduke aniyut, those fine points of poverty, those aspects of poverty that just hit you all the time. They hit you at every level. They affect your life at every level. It's at every level of detail of your life, you're being hit with the effects of poverty. This will eventually, says this source, cause a person to be driven out of their own mind and away from the knowledge of God. How can you maintain the yishuv da'at, the sense of peace of mind that one needs to be in touch with yourself and to obtain knowledge of God when you are being oppressed 24/7 by poverty, by extreme poverty? And then we get the further question, Lamai nafkamina, what's the nafkamina? What's the practical reason really for distinguishing these particular things, including oppressive poverty? Answer, Limiba'e rachame alayaho, to ask mercy about them, to pray for them. And then we get shlosha ein roin penei gehinom. There are three types of people who won't see the face of hell. Notice who the first one is on the list. Dikduke aniyut. The person who suffers oppressive poverty is not going to see the face of hell in the great beyond. Presumably why? Because they're seeing the face of hell now. I wanted to take us a little bit out of the late antiquity and early Middle Ages realm by bringing and sort of bringing our textual presentation to a close with this comment of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the famous German rabbi in the 19th century, his commentary on Exodus 16:2. Keep in mind the context of Exodus 16:2. The splitting of Yam Suf has just happened, the Reed Sea. The children of Israel have passed through. They've all yelled, "Mi chamocha!" Everything is great, and oh, look at God, Zeh Livian Behu. This is my God, and I will beautify God, etc. And then the very next thing you see is the children of Israel are complaining. They're grumbling. The verse, Exodus 16:2. I just brought the JPS translation. In the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The question that Rav Hirsch wants to ask and answer, which would be our question, is what just happened? You just went through the splitting of the Reed Sea, all these great miracles, God is right there, and all of a sudden you're grumbling. What happens? Well, he says you have to pay attention to what they were grumbling about. Why? He says, all of the Nisei HaGeulah, all the miracles of the redemption, Yeshua, and the salvation were ne'elamim. They were submerged. Why? Bifnei sakanat ha'ra'av ha'me'ayemet ata al nashehem v'tapam. The children of Israel experienced their first food insecurity since leaving Egypt, and all of a sudden, all of that great stuff that happened didn't matter. They were worried about famine that threatened their wives and children. And then he goes to say, this is what the rabbinic saying means, that a person gaining provision of food, supporting oneself, is more difficult than the splitting of the Reed Sea. He says, Sakanat ra'av amitit o miduma. The danger of famine, whether it's real or imagined, doesn't matter. Choteret tachat kol ha'ekronot. think about this in connection to the sugya from Eruvin 41b. It tunnels under all principles. Everything goes out the window. Maslow's category, or whatever it's called, ladder of needs. It goes under all principles. Umivatelet et kol hachlotot hane'etzalot. The fear of famine, real or imagined, also nullifies all the exalted ideas you may have. For as long as a person cannot detach himself, neither from the fundamental obligation to support his household, or from the strong worry, the constant fear that comes as a result of that obligation. That person is not going to be able to fulfill God's Torah in a complete manner. Poverty is destructive to a person's spiritual and psychological health. The person will not be able to continue, will not be able to serve God fully with the fear, that sort of fear of poverty. So I hope that this has opened some ideas up to you, that you have some food for thought. I am not the Ba'alat Habayit here. I'm not sort of in charge. I mean, I would like to just take a couple minutes, if that is okay with our hosts, if there are any questions and comments that
Absolutely. There's always time for questions.
So I'm going to unshare because I think it just makes things a little bit easier.
Yeah. If anyone in the chat has questions on Facebook or on Zoom, but if you don't mind, I actually have a question. I was interested. Please. So going back to Bava Batra, where you were talking about the theology of charity as tshuva, well, the poor people aren't exempt from tzedakah either. So, right. You know, what's the benefit to them?
Well, the thing about tzedakah, and I'm glad you asked that, because it also gives me the opportunity to say that something that was clear today and will be clear next week and the week after is actually tzedakah is the elephant in the room we're not talking about. Tzedakah is a whole realm unto itself. It's not that we're going to avoid it. I will answer your question, but as a realm of obligation and theology, and we're poverty. We're not so much focused on the tzedakah, which gives me now the opportunity to segue into an answer to your question, which is tzedakah is fundamentally a religious obligation. It is not fundamentally a socioeconomic policy. It is a religious obligation. That being so, there is no Jew who is exempt from the obligation of tzedakah. The rabbis, of course, understand, we all understand, that not everybody can fulfill the mitzvah in the same way. No one is expecting a person who is an ani, an avyon, a miskein, etc., to fulfill the mitzvah in the same way. There is a minimal amount that can, the Gemara talks about shlishit hashekel, a third of a shekel, which they understand in Gittin to be a relatively minimal amount. So there is that element there of it is a religious obligation. And by the way, for the principle of redemptive almsgiving, the idea that tzedakah does serve as a way to forgive sins, etc., there's no minimum amount. Tzedakah does it. The less tzedakah I give, the less my heavenly bank account has in it. The more tzedakah I give, the more my heavenly bank account has in it. Meaning if my heavenly bank account has more, then there are more sins that can be forgiven by my tzedakah. So it still works for them too, but it also gives me an opportunity to shill for 2 weeks from now, where we are going to talk about, as I sort of said at the beginning, more about the peopleness of the Jewish people and the impact of all of this, because thinking about religious obligations and the fact that the one thing Jews share is religious obligation, and the fact that socioeconomic differences, inevitably, we live in the real world. We don't live in utopia. They're going to impact on the fulfillment of religious obligations, but the deep discomfort that our sages throughout the centuries have about that, and the fact that they do try to come up with what I have termed, just for purposes of argument, strategies to deal with that. But yes, I mean, the poor can participate in redemptive almsgiving, even if, to quote a halachic source, they simply exchange tzedakah with their equally impoverished friend. Here, I have this, you have that. Let's make a trade. You've done tzedakah.
Well, it's good to have something to look forward to for the coming weeks. And people who are attendees but not panelists, if you have questions, feel free to use the raise your hand function to ask.
Let me just say something else about tzedakah. I mean, again, in terms of why I aside from the interests of time and space and curating the sessions, et cetera, the issue of the obligations is a very complex area. What is interesting and deserves exploration, and I do explore it, is the evolution of tzedakah, the production of tzedakah as an area of halakha. It may sound funny for me to put it that way, but there is something to be considered there. How tzedakah becomes an area of halakha, who is obligated, to what extent are they obligated, tzedakah as a boundary drawing element, who is in and who is out in terms of who is an appropriate recipient and not. I mean, there is a great deal to discuss there that sort of can't be slipped in between the lines, as it were.
All right. I'm just going to say, if anyone has questions, ask now. And if not, then Dr. Gray, thank you for your patience with today's technical difficulties. And it's a pleasure to learn with you. And I look forward to learning with you next week.
Thank you. It is a pleasure. I look forward to next week.
Thank you.
All right. And our Falls On classes continue. Our next class is tonight at 8 p.m. If you want to learn about this and any other upcoming classes, you can find out more at grisha.org/classes.